Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writer Center, as well as a novelist and fiction writer. So it's my absolute pleasure today to talk to Aaron Hamburger about his brand new novel, Hotel Cuba, a wonderful piece of historical fiction drawing from family stories and cultural stories. And I'm just really excited to talk about it. So Aaron, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So if you have your book handy, could I ask you to just read a brief excerpt so that our guests today have an idea of what we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so?
Sure. And let me do like a quick intro to give people a sense of, why I wrote it, how I wrote it. So I don't know if you can all see on your Zoom, but 6 years ago, I found this incredible picture of my grandmother from 1922 in full male drag. Now, as a kid growing up in Detroit's Jewish suburbs, I knew my grandmother as a sweet, frail old bubby in tweed skirts who'd rock me in her lap singing lullabies in a thick Yiddish accent. So when I saw this photo, I needed to solve a mystery. Who was this woman? And that's when I dove into her story, which became my novel, Hotel Cuba. So I want you to imagine the young daughter of a cantor, one of 11 children from a shtetl in Russia, that in a few short years gets hit by war, pogroms, famine, the Russian Revolution. She has to get away. But in 1921, America is closing its doors to Jewish immigrants like her. So instead, she goes to, of all places, the sultry, hedonistic world of Havana, Cuba. And oh, by the way, during Prohibition, when American tourists are flooding the island to get drunk and get wild. So think Mardi Gras on steroids. So picture her, she's crossing an ocean, then stepping off the boat wearing her best woolen European clothing in the 100-degree heat. She's left behind everyone, everything she knows, doesn't know the language, doesn't know this country. I mean, she didn't even know it was a country before she came there. My grandmother was a skilled seamstress, and she found work making hats. After 6 months, she paid an American couple every cent she had to smuggle her to Key West and pretend she was their daughter. But immediately when she got off the boat, a policeman pointed to her and said, "Halt," arrested her. She was arrested for 2 weeks, and then she was deported back to Cuba without a penny to her name. So that's what I had to work with. And that was the basis for this story. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning of the novel. So there's nothing else that you need to know, just to give you some flavor of the writing. And then we can talk a little bit more about the work that went into putting this story together. Fish and oranges. A salty sea of soup dotted with islands of potato chunks that Pearl can mash flat with the back of a spoon. Bread so dry, when she dunks it into her lukewarm soup, the stubborn roll remains firm. But Pearl can be stubborn too. She continues dunking the roll until it softens and melts into a paste. It's depressing, the food on this boat they call SS Hudson, heavy on salt and light on pepper, parsley, or any herb to give it character, like the shaggy dill in her yard back in Russia. Or what used to be Russia, because this year, 1922, their town belongs to Poland. After a good rain, those dill stalks grow so high they collapse under their own weight. Starving, blue-eyed soldiers from the Tsar's army used to pull them out by the roots, mistaking them for carrots, then fling them to the ground. "Eat," says Pearl, offering an orange to her younger sister, Frida, sitting with her eyes closed and squeezing her temples. "Or save it for later." "Don't bother," says Frida. "I won't eat it then either." You can't starve all the way to Cuba. Maybe Pearl sounds more like a nagging mother than a sister, but she quit worrying about her own vanity years ago when Mama died after giving birth to Frida. Though Pearl was only 9 then, people already called her old lady, housewife, empress of the kitchen, Madame Singer sewing machine. What will they call her in Havana, where no one knows her and she has no history? She might be anything. It's a thrilling, terrifying thought. Before the war, a girl from her village who'd immigrated to America returned to visit as a rich lady. Some women laughed behind her back, mimicked her proud walk, lifted their hair to imitate her short haircut, and called her new woman as an insult. But Pearl didn't laugh. Maybe someday she too would become a kind of new woman, like the shtetl girl who transformed into a prosperous American lady who could afford to coolly ignore the other's jokes as if she didn't hear. Now there was freedom. Frida, who's in one of her states, won't eat no matter what Pearl says. Arguing with her is like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. So Pearl returns to her own soup. Tomorrow she'll eat the next soup, and then the one after that, and the one after that. In this way, always looking forward, never back, she and this creaking boat will slowly cross the Atlantic, leaving Europe behind.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So in your own words, who the heck are you?
I am a DC-based novelist, and I came prepared for this question because I knew it would be asked. So I've written 4 books. This is my first one, The View from Stalin's Head, story collection, and then Faith for Beginners, novel, Nirvana is Here, a novel, and now Hotel Cuba. I also, I just love this cover so much. I have a little story about the cover. Anyway, I also write essays and stories that have been published at various places. And then I teach creative writing at the Writers Center, also at the Stone Coast MFA program, which is a low residency MFA program based in Maine. And then I teach in DC here at George Washington University as well.
So what's the story of the cover? You teased us, and now we have to go straight to the cover story.
This is a weird thing, and my friend Debbie Byrne, who is a cover designer and knows like so much about covers, will really appreciate this. I have never like met or talked to any of the designers of any of my covers of my 4 books. I've loved them all, but I've never talked to them. So when my book came out, I just did this wild and crazy thing, and I Googled the cover designer, and I found him on Instagram, and I wrote him a note to tell him, like, you know, this cover is so beautiful. And it turns out that he's from Brazil. And this was his first cover for a major US publisher. He was like so excited to get this assignment. And when I told him, I said, not only like, do I love this cover, but so many people have been coming up to me and telling me how much they love this cover. And it's just gotten this tremendous response. He was just so like flattered and thrilled. And it was just kind of like this lovely little thing. So anyway.
I love starting with a heartwarming story. This is I need like a new first question, which is, what's a heartwarming story to get us started before we talk craft? Because I feel good right now. So the first question we ask is sometimes beloved and sometimes hated. So hopefully you're on the beloved side of this, but it's, what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before?
Yes. By the way, I think it's so interesting, and Zach, maybe you've had this experience too. Whenever you tell people, oh, I have a new book coming out, there's 2 questions that are like the most frequently asked questions. Number 1, are you going on a book tour? That is probably like the number 1 question. And the number 2 question is, oh, where can I buy it? So you can buy it everywhere. And please do, and buy multiple copies. But in terms of your question, like, what do I wish people would ask me about my writing? And actually, a few people have been, which is great, is I would love for people to ask me about the specific decisions that I've made in terms of language, sentences, paragraph construction, story structure, how this book was put together. And actually, I gave a reading in New York, and somebody asked me a wonderful question, which was, why is this book in present tense? This is a historical novel. It's set 100 years ago, but it's set in the present tense. And I always think of tense and point of view as a little bit like alchemy, like it's just something almost intuitive as a writer, and you just sort of gravitate to one thing or another. But then looking back, you can kind of figure out, why did that work as opposed to a different decision? And for me, I really wanted this book to be in present tense because, you know, when you're living through historic times, you don't know that they're historic times. You just think, this is what's happening, and you don't know what's going to happen next. But there's a way in which we can think of historical stories as kind of gilded or framed. And it's like, oh, here's this like beautiful thing that happened in the past. and it's perfectly hermetically sealed. And I can look back on it, and the past tense sort of implies that like this story came to some sort of happy ending, and there's an observer at the end of it who's looking back on these events and like sort of telling you how the happy ending emerged. What I wanted was for people to be plunged back into 1922, not sure what's going to happen next. They don't know, is this story going to work out or not going to work out? And so as the characters are sort of discovering their own fates and encountering their own difficulties, the reader is kind of walking hand in hand with the character and trying to figure out what would I do in this situation? How would I navigate it? So I love that immediacy that present tense brought to this story.
Thank you. I didn't have a present tense question. I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a question I would have liked to have asked. So this worked on both counts. So my first actual question, I sort of want to cover the concept of fact versus truth, especially when it comes to historical fiction. So this is a story inspired by family history, and it's also something that's been researched to fill in, I guess, the gaps, and then the scenes and settings and other important historical details that surround it. So many of the readers wanted to know the true parts of my novel, but I didn't necessarily care about that when I was writing, because it was a novel. It wasn't a history. It wasn't meant to be. I mean, mine was also an alternate history, I should say, so that automatically I get a little bit of a pass there, which maybe you didn't have. But broadly, what's your relationship to what really happened to the historical record versus how much creative license do you grant yourself?
Yeah. So when my editor first acquired the book, the very first question she asked me is, how willing are you to depart from the literal truth of what actually happened to your grandmother to make this a better story? And my answer was 100%. That's what I've been doing all along. To a certain extent, I was aided by the fact that, I know some of my grandmother's story, but not all. We were very lucky. So my grandparents, when they immigrated to the United States, they never talked about their immigration stories with their children. And it was only until the 1970s when two of my brothers decided to interview them about their stories and record them on cassette tape, which we have since digitized, that we found out their stories. And they were telling things about their lives that my mother had never heard, because this was during, she was growing up during World War II and the Depression, and it was all about assimilation. It wasn't about individuating yourself and telling your individual stories. So we have these 7 hours of recordings, 6.5 of which are really focused on my grandfather's story, and half an hour is my grandmother. So it was interesting because my grandmother was a woman of, like, I call her few but emphatic words. And so she gave me the broad outlines of her story with a few really tangy details kind of interspersed. And then there were these gaps, and I wanted to fill in the gaps. And I wanted to know not just, okay, I was here and then I got to Cuba and then I went to Key West and then I went back to Cuba and then I got to America, but I wanted to know, wait a minute, you came from this landlocked, wintry, poor, starving shtetl in Russia to Havana with like salsa music and Spanish and the food and the fashions and these drunk Americans and the debauchery of the prohibition. I want to know, what did you think of it? And what was the culture shock that happened? And so I started delving into the research and learning about the time period to give my best guess as to what happened. And then there were so many great details that kind of like came up through that research that I just had to weave them into the story to make it kind of a juicier story. So I would say the broad outlines of the story are true. And then some of the individual scenes, were embellished, sometimes for dramatic purposes, sometimes to make the story flow. But actually, everything is based on historical facts. So even things that I may not have happened to my grandmother, they happened to someone, or they would have happened to someone in a similar situation.
I mean, how does this piece work then as like something that's honoring your grandmother, but also as, how much of this, how did you get these? Obviously, I think you did want to write I'm assuming, but it definitely seems like there's familial love a lot in this project. I sense it. There's love of the character who is not your grandmother, we should first of all say, but obviously inspired by her. So how much did you feel like you were owing your family, your grandmother, versus how much? How did that? I don't have the right question here, but I think I'm making in the right direction. How did that feel for you? Did you feel like an extra obligation, maybe is what I'm asking, to work on this project?
In other words, did I want to avoid the prospect of being disinherited for writing this?
That was the question I was looking for, yes.
Got it. Yeah. Well, luckily, I have a very understanding family who has seen sort of like fictional versions of themselves popping up in my various stories. And I'll never, in my second novel, there's a character that is somewhat inspired by my mother, who has an affair with a rabbi while on a trip to Israel. And I was reading from the book in Detroit, and my aunt kept poking my mother in the back and saying, "You're Mrs. Michelson, you're Mrs. Michelson." And I told my mom, I said, well, tell her. I said, yeah, and I had an affair with Rabbi Groner, just own it. But, I feel as a writer, like I have, and this is different for every person, but for me, my highest allegiance is to the story and to the art and to the craft. I have to tell the best story that I can. And so when I embark on my subject matter, I know that that's an inherent risk. And luckily, because it's fiction, I can always say it's fiction. I've actually written nonfiction related to this subject in the wake of the election of 2016. And I talked about the political divisions in my family. And, it was pretty raw and it was pretty honest. But I feel like that's what we do as artists. We have to be honest. We have to be truthful. In a way, I feel like it's almost doing my family a disservice to lie and not be honest to the emotions that undergird this story. So, it's interesting with Pearl. I knew my grandmother, as I said earlier, she was in her late 80s and 90s, and I was like a child when we were around at the same time. So I knew her as this grandmother. I didn't know her as like a woman, as a personality. And that was something that I got to invent for myself. And my mom once said to me, "Where did you come from?" Because nobody in my family is creative. Like everybody's like very sort of like they have like jobs that are like 9-to-5 things, And she's like, maybe from, my mother, because my grandmother was a seamstress. She was a very talented, worker with material and clothing, creative in that way. And I related to her very much as a creative person who expresses herself through a medium. I'm creative. I express myself through language. She's creative. She expresses herself through fabric and design. And so a lot of the talk and dialogue about design in this story is very often inspired by my own thoughts about creativity and writing.
Great. So one thing with writing historical fiction is there's information that needs to be shared, because you can't assume, you have to assume the reader doesn't know a lot of what they need to know to understand the story. So how do you balance telling like a compelling, moving story, which I think is the main goal of writing fiction, with educating an audience with what they need to know? So how much fact was inserted into or cut from the novel sort of along the way from first draft to final draft? How did facts, like just hard facts, get used, and how do you not overuse them or underuse them?
Great question. I think info dump paragraph is like fatal to any kind of story like this. It's just, I don't come to a novel looking for a history lesson. I come for a story. And so when I teach fiction classes at the Writers Center or in other places, I like to say that, I'm teaching writers who write in all different styles, and I'm trying to think, what do all fiction writers have in common? And to me, all fiction writers, they have to grapple with 3 things: plot, character, and setting. And when I say setting, it's the nexus of time and place. And so it's almost like a triangle. Plot is one angle, character is another angle, and setting, that nexus of time and place, is another angle on the triangle. So to me, a detail that earns its life on the page must hit at least 2 of those corners of the triangle. And if it hits 3 of those corners on the triangle, then that's probably a detail that's like a must-have kind of detail. So as I'm thinking about delivering information that the reader needs to know, I'm thinking, okay, that would be a detail of setting, right? That would be time and place. How do I intersect that with either plot or with character or with both, so that it doesn't feel like it's info dumpy, but it feels like it's integral to the story that I'm telling?
Yeah, and you do that really well. And I mean, I don't think when it's done well, people don't realize how hard that is to do. So it's clear that you paid attention to it, because so often, even in good writing, sometimes it's like, oh, you had to get, you dumped me a little info there. It sneaks in even into the best writers, but I didn't see that at all in the novel. So
Thank you.
yeah. So a couple questions came in the chat, and the first one is, did you change the names of the characters for your historical novel, or the characters' names their actual names?
Yeah, all the names are changed. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the second question was, I'd love to hear how you handle the different languages in the different places. Is everything in English, or do you intersperse Russian, Spanish, Hebrew, etc.? How did you make the decision to do it that way, whichever way you did?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was sort of a technical challenge of the book, because we have so various languages. We've got Yiddish, we've got Spanish, we've got English. Those are the three major ones. And then, there's probably a few smattering of other languages that get worked in there. There's even Italian at one point. The whole book is pretty much in English, and then occasionally there will be words from those languages that are dropped in when appropriate. Sometimes, even though the language on the page is English, it's made clear to the reader that actually the language that they're speaking is Yiddish. For example, that exchange, the dialogue that I read when I read at the beginning of this night, they would be speaking to each other in Yiddish, but it's written in English. And so one thing that I did was, when I had, for example, when Pearl is speaking in English as opposed to in Yiddish, I had the English be like a little more like someone who's learning English, that kind of English. So you can feel the difference on the page. But I didn't want to get into a situation where you had italicized portions in another language and then a little footnote or something, or, and then occasionally I would drop in little bits of Spanish or Yiddish, but I tried to do it in such a way so that the reader could make a very good educated guess as to what those words meant if they didn't already know those languages.
Thank you. So this is related to the previous line of questions, but I'm interested in the research process for this. And one thing I noticed in my own research was how much I collected but didn't use. Like, there's way more you collect than you ever possibly use, and how everything was useful, though. Even if I'm not using it in the text, it is still useful in understanding what I'm writing about a little bit. And like, I couldn't have written the stuff I did write without the stuff I didn't use. So how much made it into your manuscript versus how much left out of things from your research process?
Yeah, in terms of the research, there was like a ton that, didn't literally make it into the story. But I believe in this thing I call the bank of authority that the writer has to build up in the reader. And sometimes knowing about certain things that don't make it into the story enable you to write the story and write the characters with greater authority, because like, oh, this would have happened to them right before this scene occurs, for example, or this would have been the context. So all the research is valuable, and it shows up. It just may not show up literally. It may show up in a kind of attitude or in a feeling or an atmosphere that's reflected in the book.
Thank you. So another research question, though, is initial versus ongoing research. So how much research did you do before you started writing? And I know you had that note, you mentioned Dolan's advice, versus how much did you do during the writing process? And then did you do any more research perhaps during revision, like things you realized you needed that you didn't have already?
Yeah. So Zach is referring to another wonderful local writer of historical fiction, Dolan Perkins Valdez. And when I first started writing this project, I had not written anything set in the distant past like this. And Dolan writes these beautiful books set in all different time periods, before the Civil War, after the Civil War. The 1970s is her last book. And she said, I write a draft of my story to figure out what I need to figure out. And that set me free. That was so helpful for two reasons. Number one, because I could just plunge in and just go for it and just, write the story. I didn't have to worry if I didn't know something or not. And then later on, I could figure out if it would have been accurate, or I can adjust it. The other thing was that if I didn't have the story to go with first, then I would have to research every single thing that happened in 1920. It would be overwhelming. But because I had, for example, this chapter, she's crossing the Atlantic in a boat. Okay, I need to know, what would that have been like For example, I was fascinated that the sinks on the boat had salt water coming out of them. That was just something that I found out through the research. I was like, okay, that limits the scope of the research. And then what would happen, it was like a real kind of like back and forth yin yang kind of thing. So it'd be like, oh, now that I found out this detail from the research, the story could go a little differently. Oh, let me make the story go a little differently. Oh, I need to find something else in the research. Then I would do a little more research. So it would be back and forth, back and forth. And it would always be sort of feeding the story, embellishing the characters, advancing the plot. So it's a very dynamic, fluid process rather than like research, then write.
How much, how intensive was the research once you did the we got into the writing process? And I mean, I'm thinking too, like, I mean, I did a lot of reading, and then though I lived on Google for the entire writing process. So how did like the hardcore, like, I need to read books on the subject research go versus the modern marvel of Google for the writer's best friend, Google, for writing anything historical now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Google is incredibly helpful, but there's no substitute for being there. And so I went to Havana, and I went to Key West, and when I was in Havana, there wasn't like a ton of, there's just not a lot of records of like immigrants from this time period, that you can find, or that I knew how to find anyway. But what I wanted to do was walk around and I was looking at every building that was older than 1922. And I was imagining my grandmother looking at those buildings. And I wanted to take in the atmosphere, the light, the air, the scent of the flowers, the architecture, what it felt literally to walk the streets of Old Havana, which is where the Jewish immigrants of this time period would have lived. And also, I was very lucky. I had a tour guide who was there who told me stories about her grandmother and their lives in Cuba, which informed the book quite a lot. I also went to Key West, and I got to interview a local historian there who gave me lots of great insights. I went to a museum that had all these artifacts of the boats that used to go back and forth between Key West and Havana. And it was great to see like the cups in which the coffee would have been served. Those kinds of things are just so great for building that bank of authority that, you want the reader to have in the author. Also, advertising from the period was just such a great source of information in so many ways, because it told you not just like what people had, but what they wanted or what they were encouraged to want. It didn't occur to me that, for example, that cars wouldn't have heaters. And so I found an ad advertising like little heating machines that you could attach to your car, so you could have heat as you were going. And that's why there were car blankets, when it was very cold, you would cover yourself up with a blanket because you didn't necessarily have a heater in your car. So popular music, very helpful. The #1 song at the time was I'll See You in Cuba by Irving Berlin. And the theme of the song was, let's go to Cuba and get drunk because it's illegal to get drunk in the United States. So that tells you like how pervasive this idea of alcohol tourism was in America at the time. So yeah, and I found a weird movie on Turner Classic Movies of the New Orleans port in the 1930s, which was like very close to my time period, and it makes an appearance in the book. And I was like watching that like little 7-minute movie again and again. I don't think it's on our DVR anymore, but it was on there for a long time, just trying to get the look of things. So I really try to come at research as creatively as I possibly can. And of course, reading all those books, looking at the bibliographies of the books, finding those books. And then I wrote to the authors of the books. And I interviewed them and I talked to them and bothered them with my questions. And it's amazing how many people were so helpful in that regard.
That's great. I like that last step, and advertisements I've heard before, and I never did that, but it's such a brilliant one. And yeah, the little artifacts that survive the period, like advertising and things like that, are I think sometimes the best sources of information. So that's great.
Totally.
Back to the chat window, we have a question. Before you start writing, do you have your novel outlined, or do you plot as you go along? Hemingway once said that if the writer doesn't know what happens next, then the reader won't either. I guess there's two schools of thought in this. And what's your process?
So I think it was the novelist E.L. Doctorow who said, writing a novel is like driving your car on an unlit road at night, and you only have the light of your headlights to guide you. So your ultimate destination, and you have the light from your headlights, and it's enough to get you all the way there, but you don't necessarily know what's coming around the bend, each twist and turn of the road. So, you know, I didn't outline this story before I wrote. I never outline really anything that I do before I write it, because I like the joy of discovery and the happy accidents that happen in the initial drafting process. But I did know the broad outlines of it because I was working from something that actually happened. But what I do is I always outline my stories after I write them. So once I have a draft, it's very important to me. And I thought I discovered this. I wrote an essay about this for the New York Times, and you can Google it, Outlining in Reverse, Aaron Hamburger, New York Times, and you can see what that's all about. But in fact, many writers I talk to do the same process. So you can outline in various ways. You can outline like chapter by chapter. You can lay it all out on a calendar, which is very, very helpful, because then you're like, oh, wait a minute, you know, like it would take this many months for this to happen. And if my book starts in January, then 6 months from January is June. And like, oh, and in June, there would be this holiday, or in June of 1922, this is what was happening in the news. Oh, I can make that intersect with my story. So there's lots of ways to outline after you write, and it really reveals your story to you in this kind of mathematical way. It's very helpful for the revision of it. With my previous novel, Faith for Beginners, this book takes place over a weekend. So I outlined it, you know, after I wrote it, and I realized I had skipped Saturday. Well, that's kind of a problem when the book takes place Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and I just skipped the day of Saturday. And it was like this big hole in my plot that I had no idea until I did the outlining. So I'm a big believer in outline, but always, you know, after at least one draft, and maybe even more.
That's, yeah, I like that. I don't do that, but I like that process. I appreciate that process. Next question from the chat. How did you decide to write the book in third person? Did you ever try it in first person?
I never tried it in first person. And again, I feel like point of view, it's one of these like alchemy things that you know, it's like throwing the pasta at the wall. I'm just mixing my metaphors here, but you know, you're trying different things and you land on something. You're not even sure why it works for you, but it does. But the thing that I love third person. I love first person too, I guess, but I love third person. To me, it's like the little black dress of writing, you know, it's just like classic, you know. And also I love third person for this because there's a certain kind of a little bit of formality or politeness of third person. It reminds me of sometimes I can't even think of like maybe Jane Austen or something like that, or E.M. Forster. There's just something stately about the first person. And to me, Pearl has a kind of stateliness to her. She demands respect as a character. And so I felt like that third person, but it's a very close third. Almost like a free and direct third. And to me, that was just like the right amount of distance to get very close to her. But Pearl is very dignified. She's very polite. And I don't think she would want to let us all the way
in. Back to the chat. Given that the book is about your grandmother, how did it change how you feel about yourself and your identity? This is a tough one.
That's interesting. How did it change how I felt about myself and my identity? You know, I think we have this idea of our grandparents as being like whatever age that we know them as, like when we first met them in their 70s or 80s or however old they were. You know, in my case, it was their 80s and 90s. My parents were much older when I was born. We think they were always that age. And like, however they are, we think that's that's how they must have been at 20, just like with fewer wrinkles. But, you know, again, when I saw this picture of my grandmother, you know, I mean, this is and by the way, I did a ton of research about the fashions of 1920s. This is not like, oh, it was like this women's fashion thing. This is like a very decided choice to put on male clothing. You know, it made me think, wow, you know, like when I was in my 20s, I might have done something like that, you know? So it just makes me rethink, you know, who I am and think about how maybe other people might perceive me and miss certain things about me because they only know me from one time period of my life.
Great. Back a little bit to previous questions. How long did your original research take? And then also how long to write your first draft?
Yeah. Because it was that dynamic process back and forth, they were sort of going hand in hand. And so the whole process of writing the book until it was sold to HarperCollins was about 3 years. And then I did some more editing once, the publisher acquired it. But it was, and it's interesting. Sometimes people ask me, how many drafts did you do? I'm like, I lost count. I don't even know what a draft is. I just go over it and over and over and over it. And then at a certain point, one thing I used to write all my books longhand, and I've sort of gotten away from that. But one thing that I will do is I'll write a draft on the computer. I will print it out and I will edit on the printouts by hand. Then I will feed those back into the computer. I'll edit on the computer. And then when I'm satisfied, I print it out again, back and forth, back and forth. So that's kind of my drafting process. And then of course, researching all along the way. And I loved doing the research for this book. It was so much fun, so fascinating to travel back into time. But ironically, I have all my props ready for tonight. This book was set in early 90s Detroit, a place I know well because I grew up there. I did as much research for this as I did for this book set in 1920s Cuba, because even if you live through something, you forget, or your memory distorts, or even at the time, you weren't really fully present. And so I always do a ton of research, no matter what I'm writing.
I mean, for me, the research process is always like this input phase, because you need the input to get the output. Like if I don't input something of some sort, even writing the last project, and there was some research, definitely a long research involved. I also just had like a few touchstone books that I read a bit of before I started writing every morning, just like, I need this input so my brain gets in that mode and will spit out the kind of writing I want to happen. So yeah, I definitely feel that concept that you got to do a lot of something, for me at least, to feel like I'm ready to write.
Well, one thing related to what you're saying is I had those recorded interviews of my grandparents. I listened to those interviews again and again and again, not so much for the content, but to get a sense of their voices and what mattered to them. Because what mattered to them was often very different from what I might think would have mattered to people like them. One example was my grandfather was talking about how my grandmother was trying to teach her sister how to cook, the two characters that you met in the selection that I read. And my grandmother's sister was not a great cook. And she mixed up the horseradish root and potato in the soup. And my grandfather was like, can you believe she mixed up the potato and the horseradish? Oh my God, and this is like 50 years later, and he's still mad about this, it's really like important to him, and then another episode that I just loved was my grandmother had a fight with one of her relatives, and she called her, and this has made it into the book, she called her a machashefa, which means a witch, or really a bitch, we might say, in our contemporary parlance. And she said that word over and over again. And then she turned to my brothers and she said, Machashefa, do you know what it means? It means a witch. She was like very like this. And then, this argument was so important to her. And it was like 50 years ago, but it still mattered. And it kind of reminded me, when you're living through historic times, my grandparents lived through the Russian Revolution, World War I, immigration to America. They were concerned about soup and disagreeable relatives, as we live through historic times. And so I wanted to write the story to reflect that.
Speaking of your grandparents, someone in the chat asked, how did your grandfather figure into the story about your grandmother, or did all this occur before they met?
So my grandmother and grandfather came from the same shtetl in Russia. They didn't know each other all that well, but their siblings were dating. So my grandfather and his brother made it into the United States, and actually one of the last boats that made it before the immigration laws changed. And by the way, it's so interesting. When you hear the recordings, they're like, oh, we heard there's a boat. You got to get on the boat. If you don't get on this boat, you're not going to make it in. And then later I'm doing the historical research and I'm learning Congress is passing a law that is changing the immigration law. This is how it's filtering down to them. Anyway, so they made it in the United States, but my grandmother and her sister didn't. So they ended up having to go to Cuba. While they were there, my grandmother's sister really wanted to be reunited with her boyfriend. And so she paid an American couple to pretend she was their daughter. She got in. She was successful. My grandmother tried it. She said, my sister can do it. I can do it. But she was not successful, and she was arrested and then deported. So I don't know where she got this idea. She wrote to my grandfather, whom she barely knew, in Detroit, and said, I need $25. Can you send me $25? And he did. And, you know, on the recordings, I asked him, why did you do that? You know, and he's like, I don't know, I just did. You know, she asked me, so I did. Anyway, and so all of this kind of like makes it into the story. I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but my grandfather then becomes like a major character, and, you know, they meet again, obviously, because I'm here, you know, they meet again, and yeah, they become my grandfather and grandmother.
Yeah. Back to research a little bit from the chat. Please tell us how you organize your research. How do you keep notes, including notes on books you read for your novel?
I'm laughing because I am like one of the least organized people when it comes to these things. So, but I wish I were like more organized about it, but I have, oh, here's like a little, so I have sticky notes, and I just like write down notes on the sticky notes. And then I have like pads and pads of the sticky notes or little notebooks. And I just like jot down, like, as I'm reading or anything that just like strikes me as interesting, I'll just like write it down. And then I'll go back through my notes and I'll kind of like circle or highlight things that I'm like, oh, that would be interesting to put into the story. Or, oh, like I'll print out a draft of the story, and then I'll go through my notes and I'll try to pick out, oh, this could go good here. This could go well here, you know? So it's actually completely haphazard and disorganized and messy and creative, and I think a whole lot of fun.
This is what my research books look like, with the tabs on the side.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's the end of it, and then that all gets
probably
typed in the
better
document. Yeah, and almost none of it gets actually used, but those are a billion tabs in all these books I read. So, one more question in the chat. So, Aaron says, I definitely plan to read your book, but please humor me by telling me what time period your novel incorporated. How did you determine what time in your grandmother's life to end the novel? Which is, I think that second part is really, really interesting.
Great question. So this book takes place roughly 1922 to 1924. There's a, you know, obviously there's a bit of like flashbacking to include, you know, the information you need to know, but very limited. You know, I really tried to stick to the present story and just kind of like let you know what you needed to know. In the original draft of this novel, I took it all the way up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because my grandparents actually went to Key West years later. You know, that's where my grandmother had been arrested, and then they went back, and I was like, oh my gosh, how cool would it be to follow my grandmother there? And I'm like, oh, why don't I set it like right after the Cuban Missile Crisis too, just to throw that in, you know? So fiction is very much about time. You know, time, and the Irish writer Claire Keegan says this: time is infinite. It extends in both directions. When's the beginning of time? When's the end of time? Doesn't exist. What a story does is it creates an arbitrary start point and an arbitrary artificial end point. And the gap, or the shape between those two, that's the shape of your story. And the more time that is in between those 2 points, the more drama leaks out of your story. So now that's not to say you can't have a novel that takes place over 100 years and it could be very exciting. It obviously can, but you have to counteract that as a writer. You know, you have to know that you're working against the grain in a certain sense. The more you expand the time, the less drama you have. So in the original drafts, it was like this big, and the drama was leaking out at the end of the story. But by pushing that back and really limiting it to these like 2 crucial years of my grandmother's life, I felt like I really got a more pleasing shape to the narrative.
Great, thank you. Speaking of your grandmother, one of the things I want to talk about was characterization in the book, because I think the characters are all really, really many-layered, really interesting, really compelling characters. And starting with the main character, Pearl, the fictional name of your fictional version of your grandmother. Mm-hmm. How did she go from being an idea for a character based on your grandmother to being sort of her own fleshed out person on the page? And then also, how much of your grandmother remains in that character and how much is a fully fictional person?
Yeah. So, you know, again, I was listening to these recordings really to get a sense of like personality, but at some point it hit me. The person in those recordings is not the person who got on the boat to Cuba. And the adventures and experiences that she had and the challenges she faced must have transformed her and must have changed her and must have left their mark on her. And that it showed up later. So as I was writing the story, I was trying to determine who was my grandmother before she became this person who was speaking on the recording, who was speaking in such a strong, very determined way in the recording with very definite opinion, calling her relative a machashefa, and all those things. And so I tried to imagine, okay, how might she have been and how did she get that way? What were the circumstances in her life that might have shaped her? And then how does that journey evolve over the course of the novel? And one device that I use to sort of track her, the progress of the development of her character, is her design aesthetic. So if you read the book, you'll see that she, at the beginning of the book, she's designing more kind of like dainty clothes in the old country. And then she gets to Cuba and she has to design for a living. And she's stuck doing designs that she's told to make by somebody else. And then she tries to adopt different personas through different clothing designs until she finds like the one that is the most pleasing to her, which is not necessarily pleasing to other people around her. Part of my research, I found out that in the 1920s, the fashion palette was very muted. So it would have been dusty pinks, mustard yellows, pistachio greens, not like bright day glow 80s colors. And then I imagined that Pearl, from being in Cuba, might have been inspired by all the bright colors of the flowers and everything that she saw. And she would want to bring that aesthetic to, America when eventually she gets there. But that it doesn't fly, and she has to kind of stick to her guns or find a mix of that, the bright color palette versus the sort of more subdued color palette that was in fashion at the time.
How did the character grow and change from like the first words you wrote describing her, inhabiting her persona, versus what we see in this finished book? So how did she change over the course of revision, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think she became more vulnerable. She became someone who, and this was true of my grandmother and her sister. From what I understand, I never met my grandmother's sister, but I heard a lot about them from various relatives, including my grandmother's sister's son. My grandmother's sister was a little bit more of a maybe romantic personality. So I interviewed my cousin about his mother, and he said when she was in her 80s, he took her to a Cuban restaurant in Florida. And his mother began speaking in fluent Spanish to the waiter at age 80. And then she turned to her son and said, "Havana, the most beautiful city in all the world." I mean, she hadn't been there in 60 years. My grandmother, on the other hand, had no use for Havana, at least in what she said, So now I'm even losing track of the question you asked. How did her character? So I was thinking about, okay, was there a point at which maybe my grandmother, even though she said she had no use for Havana, but maybe she did? Like, what if she did? What if it was both at the same time? One exercise I always love to do for character is have my students, I say, okay, describe your character in 3 adjectives. So Pearl is strong-willed, confident, in charge. Okay, now think of 3 antonyms to those adjectives. Okay, opposite of strong-willed, unsure, opposite of confident, questioning, opposite of in charge, totally out of control. Now, try to find examples of how your character is both of those qualities at the same time. And that will create dimension and depth in your character.
I love that entirely. I hope someone wrote that down or take a class with Aaron and get it again. That's a great one. Back to the chat, would you talk more about what you mean by the quantity of drama over a few years versus a few days from your earlier novel?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, because I did have so it's interesting. I have these 3 novels, and they have definite shapes in terms of time. So Faith for Beginners takes place over a weekend. Nirvana is Here takes place mainly, it goes back and forth in time, but the main story takes place, it starts when the band Nirvana has their big hit Smells Like Teen Spirit. It comes out in September of 1991, and it ends when Kurt Cobain commits suicide in April of 1993. And this takes place over 2 years in this character's life, that very pivotal. It's about, wanting to get to America and then coming to America and trying to find, okay, where is my home going to be in America? And that's how the novel ends, when the main character decides where her final home is going to be. So I think it's important that a novel, particularly, which Henry James called a loose, baggy monster, it's very important that it has some kind of definite shape. That, like, if a novel should take place over some kind of defined period of time, 2 years, 5 weeks, a weekend, a month, and there should be kind of some significant reason for the length of time that story takes place. Like with the Nirvana story, you had the boundaries of the career of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana creating the shape of the story. So when you do that, the reader feels almost like in this unconscious way that their time is not being wasted, that there's a reason that the novel takes place over the time period that it does, and it adds a sense of urgency. Because the big question every reader has when they open a book is, when is this going to be over? And the worst feeling in the world is when you open a book and you're like, oh my God, this could go on forever, So you want some sense of a signpost, some sense of okay, when this happens, I know it will be over. Think about Jane Austen novels, like The Marriage Plot. When Darcy and Elizabeth get married, it's going to be over. So the closer that they get to getting married, the closer you are as the reader to being done. Because you don't want this to go on. As much as you're enjoying the book, you've got other ones on your shelf. You want to get to those as well. And you want to do your laundry, and you got to make dinner, and you've got the dog that needs walking, et cetera, et cetera. So part of your job as a writer when you're creating a story is creating a vehicle for the writer to know that, and time is one of the ways you can do that.
Great. Another question from the chat. Did you learn anything about the Jewish community in Cuba at the time that surprised you?
Yes. So first of all, there was a community. So kind of what happened. So immigration laws in America changed. The steamboat companies were making tons of money from ferrying immigrants over to the United States. Now that revenue stream is drying up. So they start marketing to immigrants, go to Cuba instead. It's the same crossing, and it's close. It's only 90 miles away from America. And so you had all these immigrants who were coming. Now, at the time, there was a small community of Jews who were already in Cuba, who were mostly Americans who were coming to work in the sugar industry, which was very profitable during World War I, although when the war ended, sugar prices tanked, and then Cuba fell into a depression. There was also a community of Sephardic Jews, mainly from Turkey, who were involved in trade. And so you had kind of Jews who were Sephardic, who the Cubans called Turcos, and you had Jews who came from Eastern Europe, who the Cubans called Polacos, or Polish, even though they were not all from Poland. The Jews who were already there were very worried that these new immigrants who were coming in, especially the young women, might fall into prostitution. And so they created a group called the Ezra Society to meet the people who are coming off the boats, help them navigate immigration, and then get them settled and give them a little money, maybe try to get them work, et cetera, et cetera. So that was pretty fascinating to me to learn about the mechanisms of that. And also there was a very deep division between the Polacos and the Turcos. They had different traditions, different languages, different cultures, and they did not mix.
Oh, great, thank you. So we're almost out of time, but one more question, hopefully for a quick answer from the chat. How much information from your novel did you get from your grandmother's children, your parents, aunts, and uncles, who presumably knew your grandmother history better than you? And how useful was this secondhand information about your grandmother?
So my aunt told me once, and my aunt, who is not my grandmother's daughter, but my grandmother's daughter-in-law, she said, I remember, Ma, that's what we call her in my family, Ma. I remember Ma telling me that she was hiding in her home during the Russian Revolution, and she could hear the cries of the women outside the home who were being raped by the soldiers. And that was powerful. That needed to be expressed in the novel. She also told me how one of the characters, who's called Mendel in the book, she said, oh, he used to stand in front of his store with a good gold watch and a fine suit and let everybody admire him. So there were lots of like little nuggets like that. And those were incredibly useful. They gave me a sense of kind of like the air of these characters. And they helped me to kind of just imagine them as people.
Great. Thank you so much. And we're at the end. So I want to ask one final question.
Sure.
It's like the final question we like to ask all our guests, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
So, I mean, read, buy lots of books, because if you want more books to be published, you got to buy them. But I would say this: don't be afraid of failing. Don't be afraid of doing something that you think is going to go wrong. Don't be afraid of making a mistake, because there are no mistakes. The only mistake is not acting as a writer and as a creative person. So just go for it, and don't even worry about the result, what the result is going to be, because you can't even predict it anyway. But if you worry about the result, you probably won't finish, and whatever you create will probably be manipulated and it won't be authentic to you anyway.
Thank you so much. I love that. Everyone, please, if you're able, buy a copy of HOTEL CUBA. We just put the link back into the chat window. And you can also get it from your local library if you can't get a copy here. And also go to your independent bookseller if you have one in your town. That's the best way. We can always support writers everywhere. Aaron, thank you so much. It's good to talk to you virtually. You told us you live close by, so you better show up at the Writer Center soon to hang out. And we'll see you around.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody.